let's sort of take an assessment of the situation in this moment. It is Thursday, December 3rd. Joe Biden, the Biden-Harris administration, has put forward quite a few names, some of whom have to be approved by the Senate, most of whom have to be approved by the Senate for his administration, and then many advisors and other staffing positions. Overall, how are you feeling about what we're seeing?
At good moments, I feel very mixed about it. More generally, I don't feel too good about it. I figured we'd probably get to this. I mean, it was obvious that's the question of the day. So I was reading up as much as I could. I always do this kind of stuff. I was reading about Blinken going to defense, and Deese becoming the chief economic advisor. And I was trying to weigh and assess this. And so I was thinking about these folks who are literally like the resurrection of the Clinton and or Obama presidencies. And I thought, wow, I mean, is this all that he can do regarding defense and economic advice? Then I remembered, of course, that there were some good people who were named to the Council of Economic Advisors. But it's a totally different story. Council of Economic Advisors is just what it sounds like, Council of Economic Advisors. And if you don't mind my just giving it a little historical perspective on this.
No, absolutely.
When the Council of Economic Advisors was created, and I may be mixing up the councils a little bit, but the Council of Economic Advisors, as I recall from my work, and it's probably in that book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, was created somewhere around 1945. The idea was that the Democrats, once upon a time, the Democrats, led by FDR, were determined to create, if they couldn't get an economic Bill of Rights, which they all realized was not likely given the Republican and Southern Democrats' opposition, there was at least the assumption that they could create a full employment economy. Now, that doesn't mean that they would support capitalism to the point that they were going to then provide jobs for all. The point was that they would put the government in a position of guaranteeing a full employment economy.
Essentially a jobs guarantee.
A jobs guarantee, that's right, that's right. And if I'm not mistaken, in the original bill, which probably was watered down, but definitely changed over time, unfortunately, in the original bill, I believe the Council of Economic Advisors' task was to push policies that would make that the case. So, okay, and this remained as a big question, by the way, for Democratic Party members and administrations, all the way through to the time of Jimmy Carter with the Humphrey Hawkins bill and similar kinds of things. But,
what was that?
I mean, Jimmy Carter was literally the beginning of neoliberalism in the Democratic Party. So forget that.
I actually think it was Kennedy. But that's, I think, more foreign policy.
John Kennedy?
John Kennedy. Yes,
yeah,
the Kennedy that was our president.
I could definitely. Would you like me to add a little history into your argument?
Yeah, I love this. Yes, much better coming from you than me.
Okay, so
because you know what I just read the books and then I come up with assessments, but I can't pull from that. This is why we have you.
That's okay. I mean, John Kennedy came back from the war, destined to enter politics, with the backing of his extremely wealthy, extremely powerful Irish Catholic American dad, and he ran for Congress in Massachusetts. And he made it clear he was not a liberal over and over again. And as people may know, his family was pretty much closely tied to Joe McCarthy, okay, of later McCarthyism fame. And
RFK especially, right?
Yes, RFK especially. And when Kennedy launched his presidential bid in 1960, it was the case that Eleanor Roosevelt, who really was sort of the most important woman in America, even then in her much older years, really did oppose his nomination. I mean, she really did. Although I will also say that her preferred nominee was not a very good choice either. It went by the name of Adlai Stevenson, who had lost in 52 and 56, and by the way, was himself definitely reputed to be this liberal figure, but was not. But okay, so Kennedy runs in 1960, eventually gets Eleanor Roosevelt's endorsement because basically they all went to work on Eleanor and she wanted to beat Nixon, I suppose. But the key thing about this is that Kennedy over and over again made it clear he wasn't a liberal. And then he ran on a platform that he didn't write at all, which was a fairly progressive platform in 1960. The man who wrote it was Chester Bowles, I believe, who had been very much a part of the Franklin Roosevelt administration and had headed up the Office of Price Administration. Anyhow, so Kennedy had two economic advisors when he was president. This is a very telling thing about the Kennedy presidency. One of them was, and I know I'm going to blank, I can't remember if it's Stein or Heller, but the point is he has, one is a what you would think of as a conservative Keynesian. That is, Keynesianism prevailed in the Democratic Party, but a conservative Keynesian said you can run a deficit if you give tax cuts to business. You can do that. And by the way, Republicans opposed that idea because they were then they really actually were more interested in balancing the books, you might say. They gave that up eventually. So then the other economic advisor, and I don't know if he actually had the official title or not, was John Kenneth Galbraith of Harvard University, who, for all I know, had come to know Kennedy because of Harvard University. Galbraith argued a progressive or liberal Keynesianism. You can definitely run deficits if you're putting it to work to end poverty, enhance the public infrastructure, and education. I mean, he really was calling for spend the money, okay? Invest in America. And unfortunately, he lost in the debate. And they went with calling for tax cuts. So if anyone goes back to look at Lyndon Johnson's first speech as president, which was only several days after the assassination, everyone remembers it because Johnson opens up by calling for a Civil Rights Act to honor the loss of Kennedy, because Kennedy had finally come around to the idea of a Civil Rights Act. What people forget is, first of all, they forget that Kennedy was not a very keen activist on civil rights questions. But the second thing is that Kennedy had the tax cut in his agenda, and Lyndon Johnson said we should also honor Kennedy by enacting the tax cut for business, which would come back to haunt Johnson himself, by the way. And for what it's worth, not too many years ago, one of these major conservative hack writers, whose name I'm forgetting, actually wrote a book that had people had reason to take seriously, and I did because of the argument that Kennedy was really a conservative. And the way he made that case is that Kennedy wanted to give tax cuts to business. Ronald Reagan could stand on Kennedy's shoulders and call for that kind of thing. Anyhow, there you go, to enhance your argument.
Not to mention the internationalist perspective and being extremely anti-communist.
Oh, yeah, yes. Right. No, his inaugural address, which became famous and is still quoted to this day, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, was a decidedly Cold War speech. And to my recollection, said almost nothing in it that would have given anybody hope that we were going to see any kind of enhancement of the New Deal or a resurrection of the New Deal years, for what it's, but
it's also actually, if you think about, I've never really put a ton of energy into thinking about that one line, but it's putting the burden on the individual in every sense.
I guess you
isn't
could.
government, can you imagine saying that right now? Don't ask what, other than wearing a mask, I guess, which would be a really great thing if people did. But I mean, this is the ultimate question in this moment, taking it full circle, is how much does this administration recognize that the only way out of this problem, or the problems prior to this, meaning the growing inequality in this country, the debt that is just burdening a generation that's now approaching their 40s, largest generation in history, of course, a growing, a crisis with Social Security, mainly because they don't recognize the need for it. But how much of this it's coming from the federal government? I mean, this is, especially with the power of so many of these states and the Republican governors, and just how much you live in one of these states where they're just wrecking working people and any sort of support that they have. So taking it full circle, do you think the Biden administration I'm almost like they're in such a Washington bubble, and they're so politicized, they're so institutionalized, and it's so much about giving back to this person, that person, this person, that they're failing to really, in their bones, understand how bad it is out there. How in 28 days, we could potentially have millions of people being evicted. How 80% of small businesses in New York City haven't paid their rent in the last 3 months. I mean, it's by the way, it gets worse and worse. I mean, that's 80% just in 3 months.
Yeah.
Well, and their response is, okay, well, Neera Tanden is going to advocate for austerity, and the rest of those folks from the Obama. I don't understand how that's going to get us out of this crisis.
No, you don't realize Neera Tanden headed up what was it called? The Center for American Progress.
Yes.
She's going to surprise. Sorry, I'm being sarcastic, obviously.
I know.
No, you know what? I sent you this thing I got from the New Republic today. I don't know if I just and the author, who's a staff writer at the New Republic, actually, they all like to raise up the image of Franklin Roosevelt, and the New Republic has become far more liberal, if not progressive, than it has been for a long time. It's a fine magazine now. It's giving the nation something of a run for its money, and I'm a fan of the nation. But this guy writes, in much the same way that Franklin Roosevelt was known as Dr. New Deal and Dr. Win the War, Biden could well be the victory over COVID president. Now, I mean, first of all, the Dr. New Deal and Dr. Win the War has nothing to do with going after disease or a pandemic. I could do a whole thing on that. More importantly, the guy closes his paragraph and he says, and if the treatment proves successful, meaning these vaccines, much of American life may have returned to something resembling normal. What? By the end of Biden's first year in office.
Like, it's God just forbid. About the sickness. Like, it's not just, it's like they don't understand domino effect. Or they do. I'm sorry. Like, this is.
Or they do. Yes, that would be even worse if they do.
This is insane. This is absolutely insane. And frankly, I'm not going to be a good team player anymore. We got to start calling out our progressive allies who are supposed to be standing up. Because if they're sitting on the sidelines, not voting, saying, well, it could be worse, then who is going to save us? If these organizations, these private organizations, are leading us down the path of least resistance, frankly, or fundraising or whatever their goal is. I mean, these are still political institutions that probably have their own goals. Then who's going to save us? How are we going to get out of this?
Yeah,
please say unions. Please say unions.
When Trump took office and started naming his cabinet, and we all realized that he was naming a cabinet of billionaires, and we could see the corruption on the horizon. I want everyone to realize that a lot of the appointments, like Secretary of Defense and what's the other one? Flournoy has gone where?
Oh God. She's a deputy secretary of Defense.
The point being,
Secretary of State. Sorry,
these people are all part of these. They're not actually called consulting firms or anything or lobbyists, but they're essentially, because these strategic think tanks are exempt from that. But these are people who were working hand in glove with the defense establishment, not defense industry. Let me be very clear about it. And now they're going to be, placed in charge of defense. I mean, it does smack of corruption, and it clearly doesn't give one hope that there would be a transformation in American foreign policy. Now we come over to the domestic side, and we've seen. Look, I mean, the appointment of Neera Tanden and she does go through congressional review. By the way, if we win the 2 seats in Georgia, then it's possible that Bernie Sanders will be the chair of the Budget Committee, and her appointment will have to come through the Budget Committee in order to become official to head up the Office of Management and Budget. And the question would be, does Bernie stay the sweetheart he's been to Biden? Or does he say, you've got to be kidding me if you expect me to endorse this woman who attacked everything that was on our agenda and has a history of not progressive action, but decidedly center-right kinds of stances when it came to doing the kinds of things that Americans need. So, I mean, all of this is to say that normal is not what we need. We haven't needed normal for 45 years. I mean,
this isn't even normal, Harvey. Like, we have pushed so far right.
Well, that's what I'm going.
So business oriented. I mean, it makes Nixon look like he was Obama on a campaign trail in 2008.
In fact, Bill Clinton once proudly said, "We're all Eisenhower Republicans now," while he was in office. But you know what? One can understand why one could make the argument that Richard Nixon is like the last New Deal president, because basically he actually did spend more on the war on poverty than Lyndon Johnson did. He signed off on the Environmental Protection Act and agency. I mean, he and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I mean, it really has come to the point where, as I was about to say, and I'm with you on this, 45 years of class war from above on working people. I mean, the working class as a social strata has not seen a rise in real wages since the early 1970s. I mean, think about that, right? And then they wonder why people would be willing to literally ignore the Democrats and turn to the likes of Trump when he was promising at the least not to pursue anymore and to actually, transform these trade pacts, which literally ripped out the economic foundations of working class life in places like Wisconsin. We don't need to go back to the question of the Rust Belt, but, but it is the case. Show. No, these appointments are very unsettling to me. And because I had imagined that I went along with a number of people who thought that Bernie really did have one of Biden's ears. And it's becoming less and less clear that that's the case. Let's not forget Jared Bernstein, who is this progressive appointment to the Council of Economic Advisors, was Biden's. I was thinking about this today. He was Biden's economic advisor when he was vice president. Well, why the hell didn't Jared Bernstein do everything in his power to keep the likes of Obama and Biden from offering to put everything on the table in the budget negotiations and deficit talks of the Obama years, when fortunately the Republicans so despised Obama that they literally were in a fog and couldn't see that they could have their way with Social Security if they wanted to,
right.
And Medicare.
Right. And I mean, and that's sort of the Neera Tanden situation too, is that they're so much in a fog that they would rather do the progressives' job of taking her out.
Right.
Than Bernie Sanders.
Why not make her the head of White House entertainment rather than the head of the Office of Management and Budget, right?
I read online that she was the director of psychological warfare against the left.
Right. That's good. Really good.
Okay. I mean, but it is very concerning. And I think that's why some folks, because they see the writing on the wall, that's why some folks just say, well, we could have it worse. We could have Reid. We could have, people worse than Janet Yellen. But that to me just feels like we're throwing our hands up in the air. And the pressure points, I mean, I always say Jane McAlevey, she's the brilliant Jane McAlevey, who just sees power so well. She always talks about power mapping and understanding who everybody is. And if you were, and we're going to try to do that on the show tomorrow. We're going to go over more of the appointments, but we really have to have a sense of who everybody is, what their backgrounds are, what the organizations they come from are, and then really where our leverage is. Is it with new private organizations? When I say private organizations, I mean they're not unions. They're PACs and C4s, and they support progressive candidates. Sure, that's fantastic, working electorally. But a lot of them are new and are young, and some have staff from other institutions. They've spilled over from other groups that have been around, since the mid 90s or late 90s and 2000s. So, we've always had this where every decade a new pack of progressive groups pops up. And every decade, those progressive groups kind of get eaten away by the nonprofit industrial complex and just the Washington Insider political bartering. It's natural. We're all humans. These organizations, the models are kind of what do that. And I say that as someone who's on a board of one. It's not controversial. It's just what it is. So my mind thinks the only leverage we could potentially have in this crisis is through unions.
Yes,
and we know how weak they are right now, and how even with them being weakened, there are only a few union leaders that have either the union membership power to drive a Biden presidency change, or the leadership, or in conjunction, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the hopes for the left should not be. Our chances should not be exaggerated. Okay, and let's be clear. And one of the biggest problems in that vein is the fact that we can talk about any number of organizations that have emerged over the last 30 or even 40 years in response to the neoliberalism that's prevailed. And I don't just mean in the Republican side, which is conservative and neoliberal together, but in the Democratic side. And the problem is, and this was something I think that whenever I think of Robert Putnam, I have very mixed feelings about his work, basically. But one of the things that
Who is Robert Putnam for our audience?
So Robert Putnam is he was a political scientist at Harvard, very much interested in the state of civil society and the questions of to what extent community has broken down in American life. But one of the things that's very clear is that indeed civic engagement, and not just turning out for a day of protest, had declined. And the only place where it might actually have been enhanced is on the right, among folks, especially in evangelical churches, because of their mass memberships. Because the case is that so many organizations, if you think about a People for the American Way, say, which had a fairly sizable sort of subscriber membership, but it's not a grassroots kind of thing. So that it basically depends upon lobbying in Washington. So much, all you have to know is how small once upon a time Washington, D.C. was and how big it is now in terms of corporate and lobbying and all that kind of stuff, not to mention commerce, is the fact that almost all of our political tensions go there. And it's also the case that so many of these organizations that claim large memberships or followings actually can't mobilize anybody.
And they're not always, when we say memberships, there's also this confusion over what is a membership. Union membership, dues paying members who get to vote locally. Doesn't always work out
exactly.
The way they want,
that's the key thing. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, and in fact, and I was going to say, in contrast to labor is about labor then and now is the folks who can turn out and go door to door. The Democratic Party has had trouble. This time pandemic is pretty devastating, but the folks who went door to door repeatedly for all of the good intentions of any number of American citizens were members of teachers' unions and other unions specific to the industries of that locality.
Look at Arizona, just as a brief example. Yeah. So Arizona, which of course, did turn blue this election cycle, but aside from that, and the $15 minimum wage in Florida, those are efforts. It's not just that the ideas were strong to fund education in Arizona, which has been wrecked, but Arizona's a right to work state. I think Florida is too, if I'm correct.
Guaranteed.
Guaranteed. Well, it's not. I didn't know what level.
Yeah, sorry, no. South of the Mason-Dixon line.
They're all So the right to work states. So the power for a union to organize is already tough enough. Right. But the crisis is so extraordinary that the organizing around these efforts. I was in Arizona, as you know, campaigning before the election, and I worked campaigns in Arizona when in 2006, and I didn't see this kind of energy. The teachers were organized and they were ready and they won, as they did in the $15 minimum wage in Florida, even though up and down the line, Republicans won. So there is so much power in a union and their message and the organizing and community building. And a lot of these union members live in red districts. Long Island, for example, has more teachers in Long Island than any other part of New York State. So sorry, I just had to brief little note about how unions won this cycle. Yeah, everybody else lost.
No, exactly. That's absolutely true. People have to understand. The reason unions aren't as strong as they once were is not because people weren't interested in unions. They were literally, when I say class war in the 70s, I mean it. They really did go to war. And they didn't just go to war in terms of propaganda. They learned how to divide people. So they pitted private sector unions against public sector unions. That's how literally they turned Wisconsin, the great union state of Wisconsin that had given public employees collective bargaining rights in 1959, the first state to ever do that. That's how they turned us into a right to work state, the state of Wisconsin, the capital P progressive state. They divided the working class. I don't just mean non-union and union. They divided public and private unionists. So basically, after decades of these kinds of things, labor is in many ways, it's weak. And yet it remains the one vehicle that the Democrats, if they cared, could turn to in favor of mobilizing their fellow citizens. And right now, when Americans are asked, and generally when Americans are asked, there's a very favorable view of labor unions. So it's all, look, the Democrats did not, you can almost say the Democrats, it's as if they didn't want to win the House and Senate.
That was a real, by the way, there were conversations about this. I guess it's about a decade since then. Back when Rahm Emanuel was running the DCCC, the Rahm Emanuel that everybody hates, he really changed the strategy of the DCCC, and it was very controversial at the time. And there were open conversations at the time about whether or not he actually had the intentions of winning the House.
Yeah.
And it weakened. I mean, they pulled out of key races, like literally pulled out. There were races that they were invested in, and they got a poll or whatever their excuse was at the time, and they literally ripped computers out of the wall and pulled staff out and left the campaigns hanging. These were very controversial and painful moves, but I think that's ultimately the question right now is, do they want to win?
Look,
This isn't rocket science. I'm sorry, this isn't rocket science.
Right. Well, clearly they wanted to appeal to the so-called, clearly they made it clear they wanted to appeal to Republican suburban voters, who, by the way, I mean, one can look at the numbers. The point is that I don't remember, and I didn't hear all of his speeches or her speeches, but I don't remember the Democrats ever making the case that if Biden is going to be able to do anything, they need to win the House and the Senate. I don't remember that being, I remember growing up, it was always the case. Presidential candidates said, and you make sure you vote for. In other words, you really do. And at the same time, labor was out, going door to door. You could tell there was a campaign. This time, we saw probably more of John Kasich than we did anybody else. And at night on TV, it seemed, they reduced AOC to a marginal, what you get, it may have turned into 2 minutes. But meanwhile, they really invested in appealing to Republicans. Now, they won, sure they won, but they didn't win with a capital W, and we know that.
You and I both know, and the numbers came out yesterday, the final numbers, 40,000 votes in 3 states. In 2016, we were aghast by the 80,000 votes in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, and what was the other state? I'm forgetting already. Whatever the Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and there was one more state, the 3 states.
Back in 2016.
16. This time around, Michigan. It was Michigan, thank you. And this time around it was 40,000, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. This is not a win. If it came down to less than 1%, it was a coin toss. I mean, it's really, I hate to put it out this way because he won by millions and millions of more votes, but we're running an electoral system. And here's my whole take on the Republican thing. If you want to win over some conservatives, if that's how you're going to get your victory, why don't you do the wink, wink, nod, nod to them rather than to everybody else?
Tell people what you're going to do. How's that for a start?
How about this? If you're going to support working people, first, there are very few, I think there were maybe a couple of union leaders or members who were on the debate, on the DNC stage, which is, even when I was growing up in the 90s, right? Even post-NAFTA, before NAFTA, post-NAFTA, in the Clinton years, the Clintons still, I grew up in Buffalo, the Clintons still showed up in Buffalo. They always showed up in Buffalo. And every time they gave a rally, there were union leaders. It was in a union hall. This is the Democratic politics I grew up with.
Yes.
And it is completely missing from the Democratic Party, even the Clinton Democratic Party, which is, what's really concerning to me is, the Biden-Harris administration, the transition team was led by Harris's brother-in-law, who's a lawyer for Uber. I mean,
right.
I think that alone just shows you how little they recognize and respect working people. It's one thing if you're going to compromise on those issues afterwards, but I just don't understand how they're completely allergic to having conversation about working people at this moment. And I'm very, very concerned. If they're worried about hegemony in this world, they're creating the problem right now. If you're worried about Russia, then don't put Uber in charge of our economic policy.
I kept thinking to myself, okay, there was no statewide office at stake this time in Wisconsin. But if you're going to try to win Wisconsin, you pretend there is. You pretend there is a statewide office going, and you tell people we're going to reverse the devastation of the Scott Walker governorship. We need all of you to vote at the Assembly and Senate level in the state and give us congressional representatives. We have to turn. I didn't hear any of that. There was no sense on the Democrats' part that they were at war with not only Donald Trump, but with the Republican and corporate establishment. And how could they, of course, with the corporate types, because that's who they are. But the fact is they could at least have turned their guns, excuse the expression, on the Republican Party and what they have done to us. I mean, that's the thing that kills me, that we have yet to have the Democrats say, the Republicans have done this to you. This is not Donald Trump's cohort. These are the Republicans.
That's right. I really haven't thought, it's not so much as they're just trying to appeal with Republicans. They're afraid of differentiating themselves from Republicans. And as long as you're not delivering a message, I was on Fox News last week and they asked me, why did they win? Why are Republicans winning in California? And I said, because the Democrats don't have they're not there. They just there's no message. They just run somebody and they don't say anything. It's like, I don't know, who am I going to vote for? The guy who said something or the person who just sat there?
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to. Really fascinating. I hadn't thought about that enough in terms of the Democrats going out there and campaigning up and down the ticket. But ultimately, where unions were allowed to operate, I mean, where they organized independent of the Democratic Party, they won their issues and their mission. And I think, just going full circle before we wrap up, is that our only path? Is our only path to pressure Biden through union leadership and union organizing?
Well, it can't be unions alone. And who the hell knows if Richard Trumka will ever hear anything I say? I knew him at one time. Let's hope that if Sarah Nelson becomes the president of the AFL-CIO, it's sooner. I mean, that question will come up in a year's time. But it's absolutely essential that labor exercise what muscle it has, not only as labor, but that it attempts to do what we really need doing, a kind of popular front of labor groups and left, and I mean this, left liberal and progressive groups. And the word liberal is almost, it hardly exists in the vocabulary these days. But there are groups out there who do want serious action by the Biden administration, and they would come under the category liberal. And these are folks who could be mobilized to the kind of agenda that progressives will afford. I don't get it. I don't understand why labor, as impoverished as they may be financially these days, is not stepping forth to take the lead on this. And you and I should talk to people we know about this.
My only assumption, just literally an armchair analysis, is so much of this labor depends on deals that neoliberals, whether in certain, this is always the issue in New York, is labor never wants to challenge Cuomo because Cuomo sets the budget, and there you go.
Yeah.
Well, and they're institutionalized and politicized. It's Washington syndrome.
Yeah. One thing, I don't know if we've ever talked about it here. Maybe next time you have me on, we could talk about what the Democrats should do, even if they don't want to come across as radical, and yet might well be able to win based on that. Because my last point, they're in trouble already for 2022 because they don't have a Congress yet that can make things happen upon which they can run in 2022.
Right. Great question. Professor Harvey, Kaye, always a pleasure. We will see you very soon. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.